People say to me, I keep hearing about the pendulum swinging in the field of reading. If we tried all this before, what happened? A few things that I want to say. First of all, I think some of the issues exist because we can only really measure what schools and teachers say they're doing. And there's never actually been a study of what people really do in classrooms. So someone can say, I do this approach, and who really knows what that person's actually doing? So it's important to realize that any approach can be done well or can be done poorly. Still, I do think that there's some value in learning what the history of reading instruction has been in this country. Clarifying that, I think, can be a little bit helpful. So around 1930, William Gray, who's a really influential reading researcher, introduced the world to the Dick and Jane series. Gray's research showed that children learn to read whole words faster than they learned phonics. So he introduced an approach that was called the whole word or look-say approach. Those Dick and Jane books were colorful and fun, at least compared to the McGuffey readers. Gray, thought, and I think it's important to mention, that by second grade, which really is kind of the level of first grade today, children did need phonics to sound out harder words, but that suggestion of his was pretty much ignored by people who used his whole word or look-say approach. This was really influential. At one point, it was estimated that 80% of schools had Dick and Jane books. But the tide was turning. No surprise, kids do need phonics. In 1956, Rudolf Flesch published Why Johnny Can't Read. And then by the middle of the mid-60s, we had swung wildly back to an approach in which kindergarten and first grade kids were mostly only taught their ABCs. If they wrote at all, for example, writing was handwriting practice, where they would trace on top of the teacher's letters, today is Monday, it is sunny. It wasn't until second or third grade that they started to use their phonics knowledge to actually read and write books. Then, fast forward to the 70s and 80s, people wanted young kids to be able to learn about the world in schools. They wanted their reading to be more engaging and more personal, and so whole language became a big thing. And one part of that involved kindergartners, first graders studying a topic, like monarch butterflies. And they'd hatch the butterflies, and they'd draw careful pictures of them, and they would say things or dictate things about the picture, and teachers would write the kids' words underneath the picture. And then they'd say to the kid, you can read these words back. And often they could. Teachers also read literature, often big books, aloud, and they'd read these books over and over and over, and the kids learned, for example, about Mrs. Wishy-Washy, who had a big tub of water and put all the muddy animals into it. In went the cow, wishy-washy, wishy-washy, in went the duck. Teachers gave kids little copies of these books, and the kids often read or reread the books, putting their fingers under the words. And sometimes teachers would cut up the sentences, and kids would reconstruct the words, the sentences, to make their own versions of the book. The phonics that was taught then ended up coming from kids' studies of butterflies or volcanoes, or when they were reading a book, they would, Mrs. Wishy-Washy, I'm sure they studied the W for wishy-washy. But this unsystematic approach to phonics worked pretty much about as well as not introducing any real books or any real reading and writing did. That is, it worked for some, but not for enough kids. So then in the 90s, people, led really, I think, mostly by educators in Australia and New Zealand, developed balanced literacy. And the word balance comes because this approach involved kids studying the world and reading the familiar literature, but there were three big changes. First, teachers devoted time every day, usually 20, 25, 30 minutes, to whole class study of phonics. Usually, but not always, with teachers following one of the many phonics programs that's out there that are organized from simpler to more complex phonics, from short A to at to cat to chat to chatter to chart. Secondly, there was a line of books that was developed by two researchers, Gay Supinel and Irene Fontes, known as leveled books. And these were written so that kids could read with more independence while they were just learning beginning of phonics. At the earliest levels, the books used pictures and repetition, like I see the lion, I see the elephant, to help kids have success reading and to begin to know words like I see the with automaticity, even when the kids were just turning 5. The third thing that balanced literacy included, and this was what I became known for, was kids actually doing their own writing. So instead of teachers writing the words that kids dictated, the kids would say what they wanted to write and then isolate a word, break that word into parts to sounds, and then record those sounds letter by letter, writing as best they could. This, of course, is phonics in action. To caption a drawing of a butterfly with the sentence, "It has big wings," the 5-year-old needs to segment and isolate sounds to match sounds to letters, to reread by connecting letters to sounds. This is all called invented spelling, and back then it was my contribution to balanced literacy. Note that the word balance in balanced literacy came from not only an explicit instruction on phonics as well as literature, but also from focus on writing as well as reading. In 2000, there was a reaction against balanced literacy and against schools having local control over how they teach. The federal government passed laws, which were known as Reading First laws, which dictated that schools, and especially this was the schools serving low-income children, could only choose between 2 or 3 huge, expensive core reading programs, basal reading programs, such as, for example, Open Court, which were based, or at least the program said they were based, on scientific approaches to reading. $6 billion of federal money and billions more of local school budgets was spent on this reform. And there were monitors running all over districts, checking that every teacher taught every lesson in every textbook in order. In many schools, kindergarten and first grade teachers ended up spending an hour and a half a day on phonics. But after 8 years of this, the federal government's own study showed that this led to no rise in reading comprehension, which in the end, as kids get to 4th and 5th grade, is really the only result that matters. On one test that's the only one test in America that's been given since 1972, the National Assessment for Education Progress, known as the NAEP, the kids who grew up through this phonics first approach read no better by 4th grade than kids had before them. So, balanced literacy swung back into favor, only this time it was influenced by the next big emphasis, the Common Core, which pointed out that our older kids weren't reading with deep enough comprehension. They weren't reading with critical reading skills, and they weren't writing with enough rigor and depth necessary to really succeed in college. So the focus shifted to upper grade work. And meanwhile, in K through 2 grades, probably half the nation's schools continued to use some version of Reading for First's core reading programs, and the other half returned to some version of balanced literacy. Now you might ask, what's the really big difference between those two approaches? And one big difference is that the schools using a core reading program tended to channel all kids to read the same whole class text that the teacher would put before them. And the text would be usually published by that core reading program. In older grades, these were textbooks that had workbooks that attached to them. Then after every day's reading, the kids would answer questions about what they'd read. Meanwhile, in balanced literacy classrooms, very young children have tended to read from a library of books, often reading books that have been leveled and that match their reading level. It's fair to say that in both kinds of programs, there have been teachers who are remarkably successful. And there are teachers who haven't had much success at all. And there's been an awful lot of research suggesting that it's the teacher and the education that the teacher receives that matters more than the approach. Other things matter as well, though. It turns out it matters, for example, whether a school has a library, whether there's good preschool education available, whether kids have strong attendance, whether class sizes are manageable, whether teachers receive professional development, and that professional development involves demonstration, observations of the teacher with feedback. Meanwhile, over the last 3 years, the emphasis on the science of reading has meant a swing back to almost exactly what we saw 20 years ago when reading first, or you could call it phonics first, was the law of the land. There are disputes now, with the science of reading people saying it's settled science that phonics needs to be the main focus for early grades, and balanced literacy teachers saying, yes, we know phonics matters, but you're taking us back to the failed Reading First program of 2000 to 2008, where kids were taught phonics and not much more. This is déjà vu. I think the question right now is whether we can stop this pendulum from such wild swings and settle on a centrist approach, one that recognizes that kids need it all. And there's another question. Now, as in 2000 to 2008, there are more and more states telling districts your teachers must teach from one of these expensive core reading programs, even though there's actually no evidence that those programs yield improvements in reading. Districts are being told to discard the carefully curated curriculum that they've developed and innovated off from years and years. and to instead teach every child using one of the 3 or 4 state-mandated core reading programs that have all the kids reading from the same text and working in workbooks. So there's a question about the nature of a teacher's job. Do we want teachers in this country to be professionals who work with their colleagues to make informed decisions about how to teach? Or do we want teachers to do as they're told by the state and to teach the same way in every district across the state? My own feeling is that didn't work in 2000, and it's not apt to work today, because in the end, teachers and districts and kids are different.